friends at school may think that it's unfortunate that Jesus died. He was a good man, a good teacher. It's a pity that he had to die on a cross. Or there may be people at your work who think that maybe it could have been different. If Jesus hadn't said certain things, if he hadn't offended particular people, then maybe he wouldn't have died on the cross. Or some of your neighbours might wonder, could Jesus have avoided the cross? Could he have done something differently that meant that he didn't need to die? Could Jesus have avoided the cross? Was Jesus a victim of circumstances? This morning we're considering the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verses 1 to 11. And in this passage we see different people preparing for Jesus' death. Firstly, the religious leaders prepare for Jesus' death. Verses 1 and 2. And Mark begins by telling us the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away. So it's a couple of days before the biggest feast in the Jewish religious calendar. Jerusalem would have been packed, crammed full with Jewish people from all over the world. And it's at this time that the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and the religious leaders have had enough of Jesus. Jesus has been in the temple in Jerusalem. He's been teaching, and in his teaching he has been very critical of the religious leaders. And has come to a point where they decide that they must put an end to this. They're scheming about how they could arrest Jesus and have him killed. And they want to do it in secret, not to draw attention to it. And they don't want to do it during the feast of the Passover. Because with so many people in the city, with emotions running so high, there could easily be a riot. The religious leaders prepare for Jesus' death. Secondly, a woman prepares for Jesus' death. Verses 3 to 9. Mark doesn't tell us the name of the woman. He tells us that Jesus is in the village of Bethany. He's reclining at the table. He's having a meal in the home of a man known as Simon the leper. And a woman comes with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made from a pure nard. And she breaks the jar and she pours the perfume on Jesus' head. Apparently this perfume was so precious, so expensive, that when it was put in the container was sealed. And the only way to get the perfume out of the container was to break the container. And that's what the woman does. She breaks the container with this perfume in it, and she pours it over Jesus. Not everyone who's present is happy with that. Some of them are very unhappy with it. Verse 4 tells us some of those present were indignant. They were worked up. They were angry. And so they scolded the woman. We're told they rebuked her harshly. At the end of verse 5. They say, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." More than a year's wages. In today's terms, you're talking in the region of €20,000. This was a vast amount of extremely expensive perfume. And the woman pours it out on Jesus, as she gives it to him as an expression of her love for him. If you had €20,000, if you had it in a savings account, and maybe you do, would you give it to Jesus? Would you give it to his work? That's what this woman does. Are you like that? Or do you hold back on your demonstration of love for Jesus because of what would cost you financially? Or because of what others would think of you? The woman here doesn't worry about what it costs financially. She doesn't worry about what others are going to think of her, what others are going to say about her. She just shows her love to Jesus. And surely what Jesus thinks of us should be far more important to us than what anyone else thinks of us. And we see what Jesus thinks about what happened here. Jesus responds to the criticism of the woman and says, "Leave her alone." Verse 6. It's the only command in this passage. And it reminds us that we're not to be critical of others when they seem to be over the top, when they seem to be extravagant in what they're doing for Jesus. Jesus' response here is, leave her alone. She has done a beautiful thing to me. What she's done is good. It's noble. It's praiseworthy. Those who objected to what she'd done had said that the money should have been given to the poor instead. That was really just an excuse. Jesus was all for helping the poor. In Mark chapter 10 and verse 21, he told the rich young ruler, "Go, sell everything you have and give to the poor." But here he says, the poor you will always have with you, and you can help them any time you want, but you will not always have me. And this was the woman's one opportunity to show her love for Jesus. She did that. And Jesus says that she'll be rewarded for doing it. Verse 9, truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. And that's exactly what has happened. That's what is happening now. So this passage shows us that when we show our love for Jesus, especially if we do it in a way that is more extravagant than others, even those who are among the followers of Jesus may give us a hard time. But Jesus himself appreciates it. And Jesus will reward us for it. And the reward that we get will be far greater than anything we have to suffer. As the Apostle Paul said, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. God will reward us for all that we do for him. And not because we deserve it, and not because we've earned it, but because God graciously, freely decides to give us a reward. Firstly, the religious leaders prepare for Jesus' death. Secondly, a woman prepares for Jesus' death. Thirdly, Judas prepares for Jesus' death. Verses 10 and 11. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, goes to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. It seems Judas is not happy with what Jesus has just done. And this is, maybe in Judas's sight, the last straw. And he responds by leaving Jesus, by going to the chief priests, by offering to betray Jesus. Perhaps it's what Jesus has just said that has driven Judas from him. And what Jesus says can be difficult. Jesus says things that we disagree with. Jesus points out faults in our life that are hard to deal with. How do you respond when Jesus does that in your life? How do you respond when you read something in the Gospels that you don't agree with? How do you respond when Jesus highlights some sin in your life? Does it drive you away from Jesus? Or instead, do you humble yourself and accept his truth and submit to him? Judas leaves Jesus, goes to the religious leaders. They're delighted that he offers to betray Jesus. They offer him money. And so he's watching for a time when he can hand Jesus over. Firstly, the religious leaders prepare for Jesus' death. Secondly, a woman prepares for Jesus' death. Thirdly, Judas prepares for Jesus' death. Fourthly, Jesus prepares for his death. Passages like this in Mark's Gospel are sometimes described as a sandwich. What Mark does here, and what he does quite a few times in his Gospel, is that he starts one story and then he tells us a second story, and then he finishes at the first story. So here he starts the first story, telling us about the religious leaders scheming, trying to arrest Jesus secretly and have him killed. Then he tells us a second story about the woman pouring the perfume on Jesus. And then he goes back and he finishes the first story. He tells us about Judas going to the religious leaders, giving them an opportunity so that he will betray Jesus to them, so that they can arrest him secretly and have him killed. And when Mark puts two stories together like that, when he puts one story inside the other story, he's linking them. He doesn't tell us why he links them, but usually the story in the middle gives us the key to understanding the whole passage. And here in the story in the middle, in verse 8, Jesus says, "She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial." I'm not sure exactly how much the woman herself understood of that, but that's definitely how Jesus understood it. He viewed what the woman was doing as preparing him for his burial. And so this whole passage is about preparing for Jesus' death. Jesus knew that he was going to die in Jerusalem. As he had travelled towards Jerusalem with his disciples, he told them repeatedly that the religious leaders were going to have him killed. In chapter 8, verse 31, we're told, "Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again." A chapter later, in chapter 9, verse 31, he again tells the disciples this. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." And again, a chapter later, at chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We are going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise." So Jesus knew what was going to happen in Jerusalem. And when he arrived in Jerusalem, He taught in the temple. He also threw the money changers out of the temple. And when he did that, the religious leaders had asked him by what authority he did that. He replied by telling them a story. A story about a man who had a vineyard that he let out to tenant farmers. And when the time came for him to collect his rent, he sent his servant to the farmers to get the rent, but they treated the servant badly. And eventually he sent his own son to collect the rent. And they killed the son. The passage ends by telling us the chief priests and the teachers of the law knew that he had spoken the parable against them. So again, Jesus knows that he's going to be killed. So it wasn't just unfortunate that Jesus died on the cross. It's not as if it could have been different if he hadn't said some of the things that he said. It's not like he was trying to avoid it. He knew what was going to happen. And as he went to the cross, as he died on the cross, he went to suffer not just physical pain, but he suffered spiritual torment. More so than we can probably ever conceive. And the punishment that millions of people deserved. The punishment that they deserved to suffer for eternity was compressed into a few hours and put on this one person. Do you realize that you've sinned against God? Do you realize that you can't fix that yourself? But God graciously sent Jesus to die on the cross, to take the punishment for everyone who would trust in him. Will you turn from your sin to God? Will you come to Jesus and ask for forgiveness? The religious leaders prepare for Jesus' death. A woman prepares for Jesus' death. Judas prepares for Jesus' death. And Jesus prepares for his death. Jesus was not a victim of circumstances. He knew exactly what was going to happen. And he went to it willingly. And Mark chapter 10, verse 32 tells us that they were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way. And the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Jesus knew what was going to happen. And yet he wasn't dragging his heels. He wasn't at the back of the crowd. He was leading the way. Was Jesus a victim of circumstances? No, he went willingly to the cross. Remember that. Thank him for it. Worship him for it. Jesus loved us extravagantly. Even though he is God, he didn't consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. Instead, he was willing to make himself nothing. He was willing to take on our nature, to become a human being. He was willing to be humbled, to die, even to die on the cross. Jesus loved you extravagantly. Surely you should love him extravagantly in return.